U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed that a large portion of eastern Oklahoma, including most of Tulsa, is a Native American reservation. In Thursday's 5-4 ruling, Justice Neil Gorsuch reflected on the promise made following the Trail of Tears. He said, "Today we are asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word." The case stems from Jimcy McGirt's 1997 child molestation conviction by state authorities. Since McGirt is a member of the Creek tribe, his case raised questions about whether the Federal Major Crimes Act applied.
And in the wake of that landmark Supreme Court decision ruling that the Muskogee Creek Nation is still an Indian reservation, there have been a lot of questions. 2 Works For You reporter Tony Russell took some of your questions and comments from our Facebook page and asked legal experts what this high court ruling means going forward.
A huge case coming out of Washington, D.C., a treaty reaffirmed by the Supreme Court. So what does that mean for Native Americans and non-natives living right here in the Tulsa area? So I asked a tribal sovereignty attorney. Her name is Mary Catherine Nagel, a Cherokee citizen. And I asked, what was really decided by the Supreme Court this week?
If Congress doesn't disestablish a reservation, it continues to exist. And that's all the Supreme Court concluded, is that the reservation has never been disestablished. It still exists. Second, it's not a restoration of any lands because no lands are going to change ownership. It's the border, right, that we're saying this border is still here. It's like affirming that the border of the state of Kansas still exists. Yes, Kansas' state border still exists. If I'm an individual landowner inside Kansas, it doesn't mean I no longer own my property. It just means it's been confirmed that I'm located inside the borders of Kansas.
And for those non-native, they ask, what happens to your land? Are you still allowed to be here?
So this is a huge question that a lot of people have. The fact that the Creek Nation's reservation has never been disestablished has no impact on individual land ownership. In fact, a lot of the reservations in the United States today are comprised of significant portions of non-Indian owned land. That's true in Montana, that's true in the state of Washington, that's true in South Dakota, it's true in Arizona, it's true here in Oklahoma. And what that means is it's just like being a landowner in the state of Kansas or in the state of California, right? You're within a certain sovereign's borders, but you still own your land. Now, the next question folks have is, well, what can the tribe do to me? Of course, I think this is a problematic question because tribes are not out there to get non-Indians, right? Tribal governments, just like any other sovereign government, has the interest of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of all the citizens within its borders.
Prior to the Civil War, much of the American Indian Wars were fought by the militia, with the exception of the War of 1812. But during and thereafter, the wars were dominated by the U.S. Army. Another tactic that also changed by 1832 was how Congress negotiated with the Native Americans. At first, politicians recognized the tribes as independent nations, then as domestic dependent nations, where they were considered self-ruling but still needed babysitting and permission by the U.S. government. After 1871, Congress saw the tribes as individual societies rather than as whole nations, making it easier to divide and conquer, and thus displacing them onto reservations. The importance of understanding how Native Americans were treated in a political stance demonstrated the dissolve of full sovereignty and respect as nations that could manage their own affairs. In the midst of all these pressures and prejudice, a Buster descendant would rise to the call. Great-grandson of Elizabeth Isabella Buster Byrd, William Leander Byrd was born in 1844 to an Engle father, John Byrd, and Mary Moore, whose great-grandmother was daughter of the Chickasaw chief Minta Ishtanaha, making him 1/16th Chickasaw, his lineage which would be as complex as American history itself. On the one hand, Isabella, despite being the only Buster to have freed all 6 of enslaved people after her death, the Byrd tree line had a long history of slave owners that began in Virginia. not to mention that his great-grandfather, Reverend Richard Byrd Jr., fought in the early Indian Wars, including Lord Dunmore War and the Battle of Point Pleasant, where he befriended the Busters and Woods. Now, this side of the Byrd family is not to be confused with the aristocratic Byrd lineage who founded Richmond, Virginia. There are no connections despite rumors advocating good old-fashioned family lore. Then, on the other hand, his mother descended from a separate tree line with a long history of trading among the Europeans within the Mississippi Valley, and one of the first tribes to have come in contact with Hernando de Soto in 1540. Both William's L. B. side were business people between running commercial commodities and being savvy tradesmen, as well as soldiers and warriors. It was any wonder he attracted the daughter of former Choctaw leader Susan Folsom, one of 3 daughters out of 13 children from Chief David Folsom's second marriage. Inheriting the Folsom surname from a white trader who married into the Choctaw tribe, the blend between 2 cultures after decades of neutrality would end in betrayal. William L. B. was 3 months old when his parents relocated to the freshly coined region, Indian Territory, instead of the century-old reference, Indian Country. The Chickasaw were promised a portion of land as stipulated in the 1830 treaty, but the government did not prevent white settlers from squatting, nor did it kick out the squatters either. Therefore, they turned to the Choctaw Nation for help. In 1837, the Chickasaw signed the Treaty of Dokesville, thus purchasing a section from the Choctaw for their settlements. So, when the Byrd family relocated from a cotton plantation to Dokesville, they were able to buy acres of farmland, perhaps inspired by a kinship with the Chickasaw, since his mother's pride held onto that branch of her lineage, and his father embraced it as well. Because his mother was mostly white, she could have easily dismissed her Chickasaw heritage and only referred to it in passing as if reciting an epic ballad to entertain guests at a cocktail party. The romance of noble savages, a notion that endures well in today, not only distorts Native Americans as a people, but also narrows a group of societies into a one-dimensional prototype. It strips them from being perceived as complex human beings. It denies their humanity by misconstruing their images into rigid statues and characterized mascots. William L. B. was raised in the southeastern part of Indian Territory, touching Texas border, where his father ran a tavern on their farmland. Dokesville would be the commercial hub for the Choctaw Nation, and through the treaty, the Choctaw and Chickasaw shared political responsibilities until 1855, when both tribes established their own constitutions. The institution of slavery continued in Indian Territory, and Dokesville was no exception. From 1838 through 1840, hundreds of enslaved people left Mississippi and Alabama with their Choctaw and Chickasaw masters. It was evident the Byrd family brought theirs with them, because in 1860, John Byrd would still have 10 enslaved people listed on the Indian census rolls 16 years after they had moved. As William L. B. became of school age, he first was sent to Pine Ridge, a Presbyterian mission school for boys. By the time Chickasaw Manual Labor Academy began enrolling primarily boys in 1852, more than likely that was when he attended by the age of 8 or 9. The Chickasaws took control regarding their future, already establishing a school system separating boys and girls, to which the nation used their own money rather than relying on the U.S. government. They continued to invest in architectural society. These were boarding schools. 20 years before the government mandated for all Native American children across the country for the next century. Despite that, the Chickasaws mostly funded the schools. Missionaries helped with the gaps and hired out Protestant teachers who taught only in English about the Christian culture, both in the domestic department for girls and manual labor with leadership skills for boys. Believing that these kinds of educational values would ensure their survival, the Chickasaw and Choctaw allowed it. William L.B. would be a product of his time and probably could communicate in Chickasaw and Choctaw languages despite English being his first language. He was not quite 17 years old when war inflicted fire. 3 months following the local attack on Fort Sumter, a new treaty between the Choctaw and Chickasaw was struck with the Confederacy. The Cherokee would also sign on. For those who sided with the Confederates, like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Osage, and Seminole, it meant defying the federal government, which forced them to move from their homelands. There was also one more reason for the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw: the preservation of slavery. William L.B.'s father and grandmother Moore were slaveholders, as was his soon-to-be's wife's family, the Folsoms. The following year, in 1862, according to one source, as records during this time in Indian Territory were sparse, William L.B. married Nancy Folsom when he was 18 and she was 19. Comparing the photos between Nancy and her father, she inherited his almond-shaped eyes, narrow brow, and broad face, an apparent Folsom feature. And sometime after the newlyweds began their life at the onset of war, he joined the Confederacy. Again, records during the time he served are absent, although one of his descendants did list his function on his Find My Grave profile. He didn't enlist as a private, but as an adjutant to 1st Regiment Choctaw and Chickasaw Mounted Rifles. Despite no records could be found does not mean he didn't serve, just indicating misplaced or improper files. If so, it would seem he was an aide to his brother-in-law, Colonel Sampson Folsom, 24 years his senior, who ironically fought alongside of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Buster Jr. at Fort Wayne in 1864. His other brother-in-law, Colonel Simpson Folsom, 16 years his senior, fought in the 3rd Choctaw Regiment. William L.B.'s ties to both the Confederacy and his wife's people were obviously close. The post-war transition caused William L.B. to make changes. As predicted by former Chief David Folsom, white settlement would indeed infringe into Indian territory. Their original treaty reneged and forced them to renegotiate with land allotments. William L.B. would be in the thick of this battle and in the thick of internal factions. In 1888, he became governor of the Chickasaw Nation and would serve 2 terms. William L.B.'s great-grandniece, L Byrd, described his character as following.
As a pullback party member allied with traditional Chickasaw, Governor Byrd stringently argued against allotment, against both black and white non-citizen intruders, and for the Chickasaw national sovereignty. He was a staunch nationalist, an unrepentant Chickasaw Confederate soldier, and a deeply anti-black racist.
In his view, as long as whites married into Chickasaw tribe, then they would be able to benefit from the authorization of land ownership. And as a son of a former slaveholder, well, his attitude hadn't altered through the years. He believed in the preservation of Chickasaw culture, but was open to having the Chickasaw adopt non-members into their society, regardless of blood purification, as long as they were white. Having only 1/16 blood himself, he overlooked genetics as long as traditions were upheld. Ironically, what the pullback party was against. Their views on full blood and refusal to marry among the encroaching whites were key positions in their politics. William Leander Byrd, despite maintaining sympathies for the Old South, genuinely attempted to preserve both his mother's culture and constitutional rights among the civilized tribes, even if he didn't always play fairly. His father-in-law's legacy may have outdid his, and his attempts to hold on to a past that may have seemed heartbreaking, but it was one that was worth fighting for regardless of the outcome.